James Walker had always done things the right way. Raised in a strict household in a quiet suburban neighborhood, he learned early on that success meant perfection. His parents, Edward and Margaret Walker, were pillars of their community. Edward ran a prestigious law firm, and Margaret was known for her charity work. Their life was carefully curated, and James had always known his place within that picture-perfect world. From the moment he could walk, James had been groomed to follow the rules. He was the good son, the responsible one, the one who would carry on the family name. His parents had high expectations, and he spent his life trying to meet them. He excelled in school, never questioned authority, and followed the path set out for him. There were never any surprises. His life was a series of carefully crafted achievements that reflected well on his parents' image. But it wasn't always easy. His younger brother, Michael, had been the wild one. While James adhered to the rules, Michael had always tested them. He didn't fit into the mold that their parents had so carefully crafted. Where James was disciplined and composed, Michael was impulsive and unpredictable. It wasn't that James didn't love his brother, but he often felt burdened by the responsibility of being the perfect son. Michael was the one who took risks, made mistakes, and, in the eyes of their parents, failed. Growing up, James never understood Michael's recklessness. He followed the rules because it was the right thing to do. Michael, however, often rebelled against what was expected. Their parents never seemed to understand Michael's behavior, but they expected James to be the one to fix it, to be the one who kept things in order, who kept the family reputation intact. James never minded the responsibility at first. He loved his family, and he wanted to make them proud. But as the years passed, he began to feel suffocated by their expectations. The pressure to be perfect, to always do the right thing, wore him down. His life, once so carefully planned out, started to feel like a series of obligations rather than choices. And while Michael made mistakes, at least he was living on his own terms, even if those terms led to disaster. When Michael's marriage fell apart, it was the catalyst that forced James to confront everything he had been avoiding. Michael had always been the one who made poor decisions. He had a volatile marriage with Julia, a woman who never seemed to understand him, and it was clear to everyone that things were never going to work out. But when they finally divorced, it shattered Michael in a way that James couldn't ignore. For years, Michael had been the family's black sheep. He had gotten into trouble with the law in his youth, dropped out of college, and spent years trying to find himself. But this divorce, this was different. Michael's pain was raw and real. He called James late one night, his voice breaking. "I don't know what to do anymore, James," Michael said, the words barely audible through the phone. "Everything's falling apart. I thought I had everything figured out, and now I have nothing. Julia's gone. The kids are confused. I don't know where to go from here." James listened, his heart heavy with sympathy. He knew that Michael's life hadn't been easy, but this was worse, much worse. Their parents had always dismissed Michael's struggles, treating him like a disappointment. James had always been the one who tried to keep everything together, but this time he didn't know how to help his brother. "You can stay with me," James offered, his voice calm but filled with uncertainty. "You don't have to go through this alone." The words felt foreign coming out of his mouth, but they were the only thing he could think to say. Michael's sobs echoed in the background as James sat quietly, knowing that this was a turning point for both of them. Michael had nowhere else to go. Their parents had cut him off long ago, unable to cope with his failures. And while James had always been the responsible one, he wasn't sure how he was going to handle this. The next few days were filled with chaos. Michael moved into James's home, bringing with him the remnants of his broken life. The bags of clothes, the unfiled divorce papers, and the painful memories of what once was. It wasn't just the physical presence that disrupted the quiet, ordered life James had built. It was the emotional upheaval that came with it. James had never lived with Michael as an adult, and he quickly realized how different they had become. While James was organized and punctual, Michael was often disorganized and disoriented. He was used to running on his own schedule, living a life that was unpredictable, like a whirlwind of emotions. James, on the other hand, had built a life that was neat, predictable, and safe. But now, everything felt different. Michael's presence in James's home disrupted his carefully constructed life. He had always prided himself on his routine, waking up early, going for a run, making a healthy breakfast, and spending his evenings reading or working on his latest project. But now, the quiet rhythms of his day were interrupted by Michael's confusion and sadness. James had no idea how to fix things. He didn't know how to help his brother move forward, especially when he had his own life to maintain. He tried to be understanding, but there were moments when he resented the disruption. It wasn't that he didn't love Michael, he did. But this wasn't the life he had imagined for himself. One evening, after a long day at work, James came home to find Michael sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the television. The kids were asleep in their rooms, and the house was eerily quiet. "Michael," James began, taking a deep breath, "we need to talk about this. You can't keep living here forever. I need to know what your plans are." Michael looked up, his eyes dull. "I don't have any plans, James. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I've lost everything. I'm just trying to figure out how to survive." The words struck James hard. He hadn't expected this conversation to be easy, but hearing the raw pain in Michael's voice made it even harder. "I know you're going through a lot right now," James said, his voice softening. "But we can't keep living like this. I'm doing everything I can to help you, but you need to take responsibility for your life too." Michael looked away, tears welling up in his eyes. "I don't know if I can. Everything I've worked for is gone. I feel like I'm drowning, and I don't know how to come up for air." James felt a pang of guilt. He had always been the one to take control, to fix problems. But now, standing in front of his brother, he realized that he couldn't fix everything. He couldn't make Michael's pain go away. What he could do, however, was offer his support, even if that meant making difficult decisions along the way. The days following their conversation were filled with a strange mix of silence and tension. James couldn't shake the feeling that his life was slipping out of control, like he was treading water in a storm, trying to hold on to something that was slowly slipping away. He had always prided himself on being the reliable one, the one who could fix things, who could hold it all together. But now, everything felt uncertain, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep this up. Michael, though he was grateful for James's support, had become more withdrawn. His grief over the divorce was palpable. And though James tried to be there for him, he knew that nothing he said or did would fix the deep emotional wounds Michael had. The weight of the situation seemed to be closing in on both of them, and James found himself struggling to balance his own responsibilities while trying to provide the support his brother so desperately needed. Each day felt like a careful juggling act. He continued to go to work, meeting deadlines and handling the responsibilities of his job, but he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something had changed, something that couldn't be fixed by simply continuing with business as usual. At home, the dynamics had shifted. His home, once a sanctuary of quiet order, had become a place of uncertainty and raw emotions. Michael's presence in the house, though he needed it, was starting to wear on James's nerves. It wasn't that he resented Michael. He didn't. But the constant reminder of the life Michael had been living, the chaos he had brought into their family, was beginning to take its toll on James. He found himself waking up earlier, rushing through his mornings just to get to work and escape the heavy atmosphere at home. When he came back in the evenings, he found himself retreating into his own thoughts, trying to process everything, trying to find a way to make it all work. One evening, as James came home after a long day at work, he found Michael sitting in the kitchen, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The room felt heavy, the silence almost unbearable. "You okay?" James asked, his voice low as he set down his briefcase. Michael looked up slowly, as if he had been lost in his own world. "Yeah, just thinking." James didn't know how to respond. He had no idea how to help his brother anymore. Every attempt to talk about the divorce, to talk about the future, seemed to make things worse. Michael was closed off, and James wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on to this facade of helping when he felt like he was drowning too. "I can't keep doing this, James," Michael said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't know how to fix things, how to move forward. I thought I was strong enough to handle it, but I'm not. I'm broken." James sat down across from him, his heart heavy. "You don't have to fix everything right now, Michael. You just have to take it one step at a time." But even as he said the words, James wasn't sure if he believed them. He felt lost himself, like he was caught between two worlds, the one his parents had expected him to live in, and the one he was now trying to build with Michael. There was no clear path forward, no easy way out. Every choice seemed to lead to a dead end. James knew that the longer Michael stayed, the more it would affect his own life. His parents had already made it clear that they didn't approve of the way he was handling the situation. They had cut ties with Michael, refusing to support him in his time of need, and they had made their disapproval of James's actions clear. They expected James to follow their lead, to distance himself from the family embarrassment that Michael had become. They expected him to sever ties and focus on his own life, his own reputation. But the more James thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't abandon his brother. He had always been the responsible one, the one who did everything right. But now, he was faced with a choice. Would he continue living the life his parents had planned for him, or would he stand by his brother, even if it meant losing everything? James didn't know if he was ready for that. He didn't know if he could sacrifice his own life for someone else's, especially when his parents had always been the ones he'd turned to for approval. But when he looked at Michael, sitting there broken and vulnerable, he knew there was only one thing he could do. He had to make the hard choice he had, to stand by his brother. The following week, James made a decision. He would support Michael, no matter what. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be pretty, but it was the right thing to do. He sat down with Michael one night, after the kids were in bed, and they talked for hours. They talked about everything: the divorce, their childhood, their strained relationship with their parents, and the future. "I don't know where we go from here, James," Michael said, his voice filled with uncertainty. "I don't know either," James replied, "but I know that I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to turn my back on you." Michael looked at him, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I would have done without you." For the first time in weeks, James felt a glimmer of hope. He didn't know how things would turn out, but he knew he had made the right choice. He had chosen his brother over his parents, over the life that had been planned for him. He had chosen loyalty and love, and that meant more than any expectation or approval. As the weeks went by, the house began to settle into a new rhythm. Michael, though still struggling, was beginning to take steps toward rebuilding his life. He had found a job, started attending therapy, and began spending more time with his children. It wasn't easy, but it was progress. James, too, was starting to find his balance. The weight of his parents' disapproval still lingered, but he was learning to live without their validation. He had made his choice, and he was learning to be okay with it. But the road ahead was long. There were still many challenges to face, and James wasn't sure what the future held. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the unknown. He had chosen to stand by his brother, and in doing so, he had discovered a strength he didn't know he had. The journey wasn't over, but James was ready for whatever came next. He had chosen loyalty, and that was a choice he could live with. James sat in his living room, staring at the letter from his parents once again. It had been sitting on the coffee table for days, untouched, its sharp edges cutting into his mind with every glance. He had been avoiding it, just as he had been avoiding their phone calls and messages for months now. They had made their stance clear. They wanted nothing to do with Michael, and by association, they wanted nothing to do with James either. The letter was brief. To the point, it was like a death sentence for the relationship they once shared. They had given James the ultimatum: choose them or choose Michael. And in the end, there was no real choice. He had chosen his brother. But with each passing day, the weight of that decision seemed to grow heavier. He thought about what life would have been like if he had done what they asked, if he had cast Michael aside to appease them. It was a scenario he couldn't even entertain for long. The thought of abandoning his brother, of leaving him alone in the wake of everything, felt impossible. Michael needed him. James could see that now, more clearly than ever. Yet, as time went on, the tension between him and his parents only deepened. They didn't call, they didn't visit, and every message from them seemed colder than the last. The silence grew deafening. For the first time in his life, James realized that the family he had once been so proud of had fractured beyond repair. The weight of the situation began to take its toll on James. He was still going through the motions: work, home, caring for Michael, being the dependable one. But inside, there was a growing emptiness, a sense of disconnect from everything he had once known. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was living in a world that wasn't his anymore. At work, things were equally strained. James had always been the top performer, a rising star in the corporate world, but now, his focus was scattered. He found himself distracted in meetings, his mind wandering to thoughts of his family. His boss, Claire, had noticed his decline in productivity. She had always been understanding, but now, she was starting to show concern. "You're distracted, James," Claire said one afternoon after a particularly lackluster presentation. "Is everything okay? I know things have been tough lately with the changes at home, but you need to focus. We're all counting on you." James nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, Claire. Just a lot on my mind. You're a good guy, James, but don't burn yourself out trying to fix everything. You can't control everything, especially other people's lives." Her words struck a chord, but he didn't know how to respond. He wasn't just trying to fix everything for Michael. He was trying to fix his own life, too. His carefully structured existence had been turned upside down, and nothing felt in control anymore. Everything felt like it was slipping through his fingers. One evening, after another long day at work, James found himself sitting alone on the porch, watching the sunset. It was the first time in weeks that he had felt the stillness of the moment. He thought about how far he had come, and how far he still had to go. His relationship with Michael had grown stronger, but there were still days when the weight of everything felt too much to bear. Michael had made progress. He was working part-time now, and his therapy sessions seemed to be helping. But James couldn't shake the feeling that they were both living in a temporary space. Michael was still recovering, and James was still trying to figure out who he was without the expectations of his parents looming over him. Then, unexpectedly, the phone rang. James glanced at the screen and saw that it was his mother's number. For a split second, he considered letting it go to voicemail. But something inside him told him he had to answer. This might be the first step toward healing, or it might be another round of rejection. Either way, he couldn't avoid it forever. "Hello, James." His mother's voice came through, surprisingly soft. "We need to talk." James's stomach twisted. He didn't know what to expect, but he had been waiting for this moment for so long. He knew that the conversation would be difficult, but he wasn't prepared for what came next. "I've been thinking," Elizabeth continued, "about everything, about you and about Michael. I know we've been distant, but I think we need to have a real conversation. I don't want to lose you, James." James felt a wave of emotion flood over him. After months of silence, of tension, and disappointment, his mother was reaching out. It wasn't an apology, but it was a crack in the wall they had built between them. "I don't want to lose you either, Mom," James replied, his voice tight. "But I can't go back to the way things were. Michael needs me. I'm not going to turn my back on him just because it's hard for you to understand." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. James could hear his mother's faint breathing, as if she were gathering her thoughts. "I know you've made your choice, and I respect that," Elizabeth said, her voice shaking. "But I just want you to know, I'm sorry for how we've handled this. I don't know if we can fix everything, but I want to try." The words hung in the air, a delicate thread that could unravel at any moment. James felt a mixture of relief and sadness. This wasn't the perfect resolution he had hoped for, but it was a step. It was something real, and for the first time in a long while, James felt a glimmer of hope. "I don't know what the future holds, Mom," James said softly, "but I'm willing to try. For us, for the family we were, and the family we can be." The conversation ended with a promise to meet soon, to talk in person. James set the phone down and let out a long breath. It wasn't an answer, it wasn't a solution, but it was a start. As the days passed, the heaviness that had been weighing on him began to lift, if only a little. The future was still uncertain, but at least now, there was a possibility of healing. He still had a long way to go, but he wasn't walking that path alone anymore. That night, James sat down with Michael, and for the first time in weeks, they spoke without the looming weight of the world hanging over them. It wasn't a perfect conversation, but it was honest. It was a step forward. "We'll get through this, James," Michael said quietly, his voice filled with a new sense of hope. "You've always been there for me, and I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful, and I'll keep trying, for you and for the kids." James smiled, the words feeling like a weight lifting off his chest. For the first time in a long time, he believed it. They would get through this. Together. The days after the conversation with his mother passed slowly, with an undercurrent of tension and hope. James couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, but he also knew that it would take time. Time for his parents to adjust, time for Michael to heal, and time for himself to finally break free from the suffocating expectations that had defined so much of his life. Michael, for his part, was making slow but steady progress. His part-time job was keeping him busy, and the therapy sessions were helping him to understand the emotional damage that the divorce had caused. He wasn't entirely himself yet. There were still moments of withdrawal and sadness. But James could see the small glimmers of his brother returning to form. The laughter, the sarcasm, the old Michael that James had missed so much. But for James, the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on him. He had made a choice, the choice to stand by Michael, to be there for him when no one else would. He didn't regret it, but the toll it was taking on him was becoming harder to ignore. His work performance had slipped further, and while he tried to maintain his usual outward composure, the stress was eating away at him. One evening, after yet another long day at work, James came home to find Michael sitting on the porch, his legs dangling over the edge, looking out into the dimming evening. The sky was painted with shades of orange and purple, but James could only focus on the silence between them. "Everything okay?" James asked as he approached, settling beside Michael. Michael didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared out into the horizon, his face set in a frown. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft but heavy with meaning. "You're still carrying this weight, aren't you?" James didn't respond immediately, the words trapped in his throat. It was true. He had been carrying the weight of everything: his parents' rejection, Michael's pain, his own sense of guilt for abandoning the life his parents had wanted for him. He had always been the one to hold things together, to solve problems, but now he felt lost. He didn't know how to fix this. "I'm fine," James said, his voice strained. "Just tired." Michael chuckled lightly, but there was no humor in it. "You don't look fine, man. You look like you're barely holding it together. You've been carrying me for too long." James sighed. He knew Michael was right, but he didn't know how to let go. He had always been the one to fix things. That was his role in the family. And now, with everything in disarray, he didn't know who he was anymore. He had tried to live up to his parents' ideals, to keep the family reputation intact. But at what cost? "I don't know how to do this anymore, Michael," James said, his voice faltering. "I'm trying to be there for you, but I can't ignore the rest of my life. I don't know where I fit anymore. I'm not sure I even recognize myself." Michael turned to face his brother, his expression softening. "You've been carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations for so long that you've forgotten who you are. And now, you're doing it to yourself. You don't have to be perfect, James. You don't have to fix everything for everyone." James looked away, the words cutting deep. It wasn't that he didn't know what Michael was saying, it was that he didn't know how to stop. For so long, he had built his life around the idea of pleasing others, of being the one everyone could rely on. Letting go of that, even for a moment, felt impossible. "I don't know how to stop," James admitted quietly. "It's all I've known." "You don't have to stop everything at once," Michael said gently. "But maybe it's time to stop being everything for everyone else. Start being something for yourself." The silence between them stretched. But this time, it was different. It wasn't suffocating. It was thoughtful. James didn't know what to say. But as he sat there next to Michael, he realized that his brother was right. He had spent so long trying to fix everyone else that he had lost sight of what he needed. He wasn't sure where to begin, but for the first time in months, he felt like he was ready to try. The following days were filled with difficult decisions and moments of reflection. James continued to support Michael, but he also began to take small steps to reclaim his own life. He started by reaching out to a therapist, something he had avoided for years. The idea of therapy felt foreign, like admitting weakness, but he knew it was necessary. He needed someone to talk to, someone to help him navigate the mess of emotions that had built up over the years. At work, James spoke with Claire, his boss, about taking a step back. He needed to reassess his role, find a way to balance his responsibilities without losing himself in the process. Claire was understanding, but there was a lingering sense of guilt in James's chest. He wasn't used to asking for help, and doing so now felt like he was failing in some way. But Claire's support made it easier. She reassured him that it was okay to take a break, to focus on his mental health, that it wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a sign of strength. As he began to make these small changes, James started to feel a shift in himself. He didn't have all the answers, and he wasn't sure how things would play out. But for the first time in a long time, he was taking control of his life, not by fixing everything, but by allowing himself the space to heal. One afternoon, as he walked through the park near his home, James saw Michael playing with the kids in the distance. They were laughing, running around, their energy contagious. Michael's face was lighter now, not as weighed down by his past. James could see that his brother was on the road to recovery. It wasn't going to be a quick fix, but it was progress. And for the first time in months, James felt the weight of everything lift, even if just for a moment. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a start. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, James sat on the porch, his thoughts clearer than they had been in weeks. He knew there was still much to do, much to face. But as he looked out over the horizon, he finally felt like he was moving towards something real. For the first time in a long time, he was choosing himself, choosing his brother, choosing what mattered most. The days had started to blur together in a sea of unfinished tasks and unspoken thoughts. James had begun to settle into his new routine, one where he tried to balance his life with the needs of his brother and the demands of his job. But no matter how hard he tried to stay grounded, the looming uncertainty of what lay ahead continued to gnaw at him. Michael had made significant progress. He was working more consistently now, and the emotional cracks that had once consumed him were beginning to heal. But James could see that Michael wasn't out of the woods yet. His brother was still fighting battles that James couldn't always understand, and despite his attempts to help, he could sense the distance growing between them. It wasn't that Michael was ungrateful, far from it. It was just that some things, some pains, couldn't be shared. And those were the ones that weighed most heavily. One evening, as James came home from work, he noticed that Michael was sitting at the kitchen table, his head buried in his hands. The apartment felt colder than usual, the kind of cold that settled in the bones. "Michael?" James called out softly, his voice tinged with concern. Michael looked up, his face pale, his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night. He didn't speak at first, just stared at James with a mixture of frustration and helplessness. "I don't know what to do anymore, James," Michael said, his voice hoarse. "I feel like I'm stuck, like I'm not getting any closer to moving on." James set his briefcase down, walking toward the table, his thoughts racing. It was the same pattern, over and over. Michael had good days, and then he had bad days. James had thought that after everything, after the divorce, the therapy, the job, things would have started to feel easier. But they hadn't. It was a constant struggle for Michael to pull himself from the depths of despair. And James had been with him through every moment, offering support, advice, and unconditional love. But the toll it was taking on him was starting to show. "Listen, Michael," James said quietly, sitting down across from him. "You're going to have good days and bad days. That's part of this. But you're here. You're working through it, and that's all we can do right now." Michael shook his head, the frustration bubbling over. "I'm just so lost. It's like I can't escape it. Every time I try to move forward, I'm pulled back into the past. I don't know how to get out of it." James placed a hand on his brother's arm, offering the only comfort he knew how to give. "You will, Michael. You're already doing it. You're already taking steps." Michael looked up, his eyes filled with vulnerability. "I don't know if I can keep going like this. I don't know how much more of this I can take." For a moment, James was silent, weighing his words carefully. He had been walking a fine line between support and tough love for weeks now, but it was clear that the time for gentle encouragement had passed. Michael was stuck in his own mind, and James couldn't keep carrying him forever, not at the cost of his own sanity. "You have to start believing that you can," James said, his voice firm but caring. "You have to start believing that you deserve more than this. I know it's not easy, but you can't keep living in the past. You can't keep letting it control you." Michael stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I don't know how to do that. I don't know where to begin." "You start where you are," James replied, standing up as well. "You start by making small choices that push you forward. You don't need to fix everything at once. Just take it one step at a time." There was a long pause as Michael stared at his brother, the weight of the words hanging between them. Finally he spoke, his voice softer now, though still filled with doubt. "I wish I could just move on. I wish I could just forget." James looked at him, understanding the depth of the pain in his brother's eyes. "You can't forget, Michael, but you can heal, and healing doesn't happen overnight." In the days that followed, things didn't get easier, but they began to change. Michael made the decision to finally reach out to his therapist for additional sessions. He took small steps, going to work consistently, spending time with his kids, and trying to reestablish the relationships that had been strained by his divorce. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. James, too, began to see things more clearly. He was still struggling with his own feelings of guilt and responsibility, but something had shifted. Michael wasn't just a project for him anymore. He wasn't a burden or a problem to solve. He was his brother, and for the first time, James allowed himself to see that they both had their own healing to do. They didn't need to have all the answers, but they needed to keep moving forward, together. That evening, after another long day, James came home to find Michael sitting in the living room with a piece of paper in his hands. He looked up as James entered. "I've been thinking," Michael said slowly, his voice uncertain. "I've made some decisions. I'm going to start taking control of my life again. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I can't keep living in this fog." James felt a weight lift from his chest. He could see the difference in Michael's eyes, a flicker of hope, a willingness to try again. "That's good, Michael," James said, a smile tugging at his lips. "That's all we can do. Keep moving forward." Michael nodded, then looked down at the paper in his hands. "I've also started writing, I think. It's a way for me to process everything. It's helping." James sat down beside him. "I'm proud of you, man." For the first time in months, the tension in the room seemed to ease. Michael wasn't out of the woods yet, but he was on his way, and that gave James a sense of peace. Maybe things didn't have to be perfect. Maybe it was enough to keep trying, to keep moving forward, one step at a time. The days ahead weren't without their challenges, but they were filled with the promise of change. James still had his own battles to face: his strained relationship with his parents, his lingering guilt, the pressure of balancing his own life with Michael's needs. But he had come to realize that there was no perfect solution. Life was messy, unpredictable, and sometimes the best thing you could do was to show up and keep moving forward, even when you didn't have all the answers. James had chosen his brother. He had chosen loyalty over reputation, love over perfection. And even though the road ahead was uncertain, it was a road he was willing to walk, step by step,